10 paroled serial killers and murderers. Welcome back to Creepshow, where we uncover the chilling truths hiding in the shadows of society. Today, we're delving into the unsettling world of parole, a system meant to rehabilitate prisoners and reintegrate them into society. But what happens when those released aren't just ordinary criminals? What happens when the paroled are convicted serial killers and mass murderers? Despite their horrific crimes, these individuals were given a second chance, often with devastating consequences. Join us as we uncover 10 cases where murderers walked free only to continue their dark legacies. Number 10. Kenneth Allen McDuff. Kenneth Allen McDuff is one of the most notorious cases of a murderer set free, only to kill again. Described by law enforcement as more evil than the devil himself, McDuff's story is a grim reminder of the failures within the parole system. His killing spree began in 1966 when he brutally murdered 3 teenagers in Texas. Originally sentenced to death, his punishment was commuted to life imprisonment when the Supreme Court temporarily abolished the death penalty in 1972. Then, in a shocking twist, McDuff was released in 1989, not because he had shown signs of rehabilitation, but due to overcrowded prisons. Upon release, McDuff quickly returned to a life of crime. In 1990, he was arrested after terrorizing a group of black teenagers, chasing them with a weapon and hurling racial slurs. But despite this violent incident and his disturbing behavior, at the parole hearing, the parole board didn't revoke his freedom. Once back on the streets, he escalated his crimes to murder. Between 1989 and 1992, McDuff killed at least 3 women, including convenience store clerk Melissa Northrup and accountant Colleen Reed. McDuff was finally recaptured and executed by lethal injection in 1998. His case is a tragic example of a parole board's grave misjudgment, and it left a haunting legacy that still lingers in Texas, with families and law enforcement alike questioning how a killer like McDuff was ever allowed back into society. Number 9. Loren Herzog. Loren Herzog, one half of California's infamous speed freak killers, committed his final act of violence on himself. Alongside his childhood friend Wesley Shermantine, Herzog was responsible for a series of brutal murders in the 1980s and 1990s. The 2 men, who earned their nickname for committing their crimes under the influence of methamphetamine, were initially linked to the disappearance and murder of Cindy Vanderheiden. Herzog was convicted and sentenced to 78 years to life for murder and rape, but in 2004, an appeals court determined that his confession had likely been coerced, opening the door for a new trial. In an unexpected twist, Herzog struck a plea deal, accepting a reduced charge of manslaughter. This led to a drastically reduced sentence, and in 2010, he was paroled after serving just 14 years. His release was met with outrage and fear, and he was closely monitored by authorities through a GPS tracking bracelet. For his own safety and to quell public outcry, Herzog was housed in a trailer on fenced-off property near the prison. 2 years later, in 2012, his parole agent noticed something unusual. Herzog's tracking bracelet was showing a low battery. Unable to reach him by phone, the agent notified local authorities. When police arrived at Herzog's trailer, they found him dead in what was believed to be a suicide. The timing was significant. Herzog's former accomplice, Shermantine, had just reached out to authorities, offering to reveal the locations of their victims' bodies in exchange for financial compensation. Sacramento bounty hunter Leonard Padilla relayed this information to Herzog shortly before his death, suggesting that Shermantine might expose more of their dark past, potentially implicating Herzog in even more unsolved murders. The discovery of additional bodies could have meant new charges and trials for Herzog, if he had lived to face them. Herzog's death left behind countless unanswered questions, and the gruesome legacy of the speed freak killers continues to haunt the families of their victims. His case highlights the challenges of parole for violent offenders and raises concerns about the potential dangers of releasing such individuals back into society. Number 8. Michael Keith Moon. Michael Keith Moon's criminal record reads like a disturbing pattern of escalating violence, highlighting the repeated failures of the justice system to prevent a known killer from returning to society. His violent history began in 1981 when he was convicted for the brutal stabbing of a woman in Reno, Nevada. After serving 10 years, Moon was paroled in 1991 and moved to Illinois, but any hope of reformation was quickly shattered. Shortly after his release, Moon was convicted of attempted murder in Woodstock, Illinois, for repeatedly stabbing a man in a bar fight. This violent incident landed him back in prison, but he was once again granted parole in 2005. By then, his life of violence was already well established. Moving to California, Moon continued his deadly streak, and in 2008, he was convicted of second-degree murder for killing a 24-year-old man in Escondido. Yet again, in 2014, he was released, this time moving into a halfway house in downtown San Diego. Moon's violent history has led some investigators, like Escondido detective Chuck Gaylor, to suspect that he may be a serial killer, potentially linked to other unsolved murders across multiple states. With a trail of deadly assaults spanning Nevada, Illinois, and California, Moon's case highlights the risks of repeatedly paroling dangerous offenders. Authorities still speculate that his crimes might only be partially uncovered, and Gaylor's suspicions remain a chilling reminder that Michael Keith Moon's criminal history could be even darker than we know. His case poses an unsettling question. How many chances should a convicted murderer receive? Moon's repeated offenses underline the tragic consequences of a system that continually granted him freedom, only for him to return to violence each time. Number 7. Louis Vonore. Louis Vonore, a former South African police officer and security guard, became notorious for his brutal actions during the 1980s apartheid era. His role involved responding to silent alarms in businesses, and he claimed that he would use deadly force to protect property. Between 1986 and 1989, Vonore admitted to shooting around 100 people, ultimately resulting in at least 7 confirmed deaths and 2 attempted murders. Convicted in 1992, Vonore was sentenced to 20 years in prison. However, he served only 12 years before being released on parole in 2004. Upon his release, he was greeted by his fiancée, Cape Town lawyer Eunice de Kock, as he stepped back into a society forever scarred by his actions. Many in South Africa were horrified by his early release, given the sheer number of shootings he committed under the pretext of defending businesses from would-be criminals. Vonore expressed a desire to be judged by his future actions rather than his violent past, claiming he wanted to start anew. Initially, he offered no apologies to the families of his victims, but he later suggested that he would appreciate their forgiveness. His words did little to ease the anger and grief of those left behind who felt that justice had not been fully served. For them, Vonore's release was not only an injustice, but also a reminder of the unresolved pain caused by his actions. Louis Vonore's case raises troubling questions about the intersection of law enforcement, vigilantism, and the parole system. He remains a controversial figure, one who slipped back into society despite a legacy of violence and the scars he left on countless families. Number 6. William Huff. William Huff, who called himself the Phantom, was responsible for a pair of brutal child murders in 1967 that left the community of Sierra Vista, Arizona, shaken. His first victim was 7-year-old Cindy Cleland, who disappeared on April 30th while collecting bottles to exchange for candy at a nearby store. 2 days later, her body was found, and police received a chilling handwritten note from Huff calling himself the Phantom. The note warned of another intended victim, a 9-year-old girl on Stefan Street, taunting the police by calling them fools. Police took swift action, assigning round-the-clock protection to the targeted girl. But Huff shifted his sights to another child, 6-year-old Janelle Haynes, the daughter of a local military officer. On June 22, Janelle was playing near a pond by the Lakeside Officers Club when Huff abducted her. Her body was found that same day, naked like Cindy's. Police had already identified Huff, a local teenager, as a suspect, and a handwriting sample linked him to the threatening note left after Cindy's murder. Following his conviction, Huff was sentenced to 15 years for one murder and 40 for the other. The sentence seemed inadequate given the nature of his crimes, and his eventual release left many feeling that justice had not been fully served. In a decision that sparked outrage, the parole board voted unanimously in 2005 to grant him parole, and in 2006, Huff was placed under house arrest in a halfway house in Tucson. Ellen Kirschbaum, the parole board chair at the time, expressed uncertainty about Huff's potential for recidivism. She admitted that she couldn't predict whether he might kill again, leaving the community uneasy with the knowledge that a self-proclaimed child killer was now free. Huff's case underscores the haunting reality that sometimes the most violent criminals can and do walk free even after committing the most heinous acts. Number 5. Vernon Tatum. Vernon Tatum, a convicted rapist and serial killer, was responsible for a series of brutal attacks on elderly women that shocked Kansas City, Missouri. Arrested for his crimes, he was sentenced to prison, serving 13 years for the horrific acts of rape and murder. Known for his violent tendencies, Tatum's release in 2017 raised serious concerns within the community and among law enforcement officials. Despite his violent history, he was granted parole due to what officials deemed good behavior while he was behind bars. After leaving prison, Tatum spent time in a halfway house, but soon made plans to return to the same Kansas City neighborhood where he had once terrorized residents. The news of his return disturbed many, particularly local police who had worked on his case. Police Detective Lester Scott, one of the officers involved, described Tatum as one of the most dangerous individuals he had ever encountered, a sentiment echoed by others who feared Tatum's return would bring renewed danger to the community. His case underscores the significant risks associated with parole decisions for violent offenders. Many believe that allowing someone with such a severe history of brutality back into society places others at undue risk. Vernon Tatum's release highlights the ongoing debate surrounding the parole system, the effectiveness of rehabilitation for violent criminals, and the safety of the communities they are released into. Number 4. Arthur Shawcross. Arthur Shawcross, often referred to as the Genesee River Killer, started his murderous path in 1972 at the age of 27. His first known victims were 2 children in Watertown, New York, 10-year-old Jack Owen Blake and 8-year-old Karen Ann Hill. Shawcross lured young Jack into the woods under the pretext of a fishing trip and later murdered him. Just a few months afterward, he abducted Karen, leading her to an isolated area where he assaulted and killed her. Shawcross was quickly apprehended after eyewitnesses reported seeing him with the children. In a shocking turn, he struck a plea deal, confessing to both murders but ultimately being charged with only 1 count of manslaughter. He received a 25-year sentence. Despite the brutality of his crimes, Shawcross was granted parole in 1987 after serving just 14 years, considered a model prisoner. Worse still, authorities sealed his criminal record, allowing him to relocate to Rochester, New York, without the community's knowledge of his violent past. Not long after settling in Rochester, Shawcross began targeting vulnerable women, particularly prostitutes. Between 1988 and 1989, he embarked on a gruesome killing spree, murdering at least 10 women. His method was horrifyingly consistent. He would asphyxiate his victims, mutilating their bodies before dumping them near the Genesee River. Shawcross was finally caught after a helicopter pilot spotted him near one of the crime scenes. In custody, he confessed to the murders, providing details that confirmed his involvement. His past caught up with him, and he was sentenced to 250 years in prison, where he died in 2008. The case of Arthur Shawcross is a chilling example of a parole system that failed catastrophically. Released after serving only half of his original sentence, he went on to claim numerous lives, a tragic consequence that serves as a haunting reminder of the dangers inherent in releasing violent offenders back into society. Number 3. Louise Pete. Louise Pete was a woman whose charm masked a chilling pattern of murder and deceit. Her first known victim was Jacob Charles Denton, a wealthy man whom she murdered in Los Angeles in 1920. Pete had lived in Denton's home and, after his disappearance, continued to act as though she owned the property. When Denton's decomposing body was discovered buried in the basement, Pete was convicted of his murder and sentenced to life in prison. However, in 1939, she was paroled after serving just 18 years, on the condition that she lead a law-abiding life. But Pete had other plans. Upon release, she moved in with Margaret Logan, a woman she had befriended, whose husband, Arthur, was institutionalized at the time. In 1944, Margaret was found dead, buried in a shallow grave in her backyard in Pacific Palisades. Pete was arrested and claimed that Arthur, Margaret's husband, had killed his wife, and that she had buried the body out of fear she would be wrongfully accused. But the authorities quickly exposed her story as a lie. Arthur had already died in an asylum before Margaret's murder. The prosecutors established that Pete, driven by greed, had killed Margaret to gain control of her estate. During the trial, it became clear that this wasn't just a story of an unfortunate parolee returning to crime. It was a case of calculated cold-blooded murder. Pete was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. She met her end in San Quentin State Prison's gas chamber on April 11, 1947. In her final moments, she told the warden, "I've been ready for a long time." Louise Pete's case serves as a cautionary tale of how some individuals, even after being granted a second chance, may revert to their dark paths. Her motives were clear: money and control, sought at any cost, even if it meant taking the lives of those who trusted her. Number 2. Gerald Gallego and Charlene Williams. Gerald Gallego's early criminal history showed a pattern of violent behavior, and multiple paroles only paved the way for a more sinister path. Initially paroled in 1961 after less than a year in a juvenile facility for lewd acts with a young girl, Gallego was released again in 1963 after serving 2 years for armed robbery. These brief incarcerations failed to curb his violent tendencies, which escalated over time. In 1978, Gallego met Charlene Williams at a poker club in Sacramento, California. They quickly became a team, embarking on a horrifying crime spree. The couple began abducting young girls in California and Nevada, using them as sex slaves before murdering them. Their first victims were Rhonda Scheffler, 17, and Kippy Vaught, 16. Gallego shot both girls after taking them to a remote area, setting a pattern for what would become a trail of devastation. Over the next 2 years, Gallego and Williams abducted and killed a total of 10 victims, primarily teenage girls. Their final victims were Craig Miller, 22, and his fiancée, Mary Elizabeth Sowers, 21. A friend witnessed the couple entering Gallego's car and, suspecting something was wrong, noted the license plate. After Gallego shot Miller, the couple then drove Sowers to a second location, where he sexually assaulted and killed her. When Miller and Sowers didn't return, the witness provided the license plate number to authorities, leading to the couple's capture. Gallego was ultimately convicted and sentenced to death in 1984. Williams, who cooperated with authorities and testified against Gallego, received a lighter sentence of 16 years and 8 months. She was paroled in 1997. The case of Gerald Gallego and Charlene Williams serves as a stark reminder of the risks involved in the parole process and how early releases can have devastating consequences. Number 1. Richard Marquette. Richard Marquette's case is one of the most horrifying examples of a serial killer set free, only to commit more murders. Convicted initially for the gruesome murder of Joan Ray Caudle in 1961, Marquette's method was chillingly calculated. After meeting Caudle at a bar in Portland, Oregon, he strangled her during an argument following a consensual encounter. To conceal his crime, he dismembered her body and stored the parts in his freezer with the intention of consuming them later. His capture came on June 30th of that year, and he was convicted in December, receiving a life sentence. Remarkably, Marquette was paroled after serving only 12 years. Fellow inmates had voiced concerns that he would kill again if released, but these warnings went unheeded. Shortly after gaining his freedom, he did indeed return to his murderous ways. Although one of these murders went undetected, he couldn't escape justice for long. Marquette's next known victim was 37-year-old Betty Wilson. He murdered and dismembered her in Salem, Washington, with evidence so overwhelming that authorities quickly linked him to the crime. He was sentenced once again to life in prison. These disturbing events highlight the tragic risks of paroling violent offenders, especially those convicted of brutal crimes. Marquette's case underscores the complex and often devastating consequences of allowing a serial killer back into society, even with attempts at rehabilitation. These cases remind us that sometimes the justice system can have unexpected, even deadly, consequences. The release of these individuals raises questions about public safety, rehabilitation, and the chilling possibility that not all monsters stay behind bars. Thanks for joining us on this dark journey. If you found this video thought-provoking, give it a like, subscribe to Creepshow for more eerie tales, and hit the bell icon to stay updated on our latest content. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay safe, and keep a watchful eye on the shadows.